Happy New Year, welcome to Sport Unlocked at the start of 2023 with me, Rob Harris from Sky News, Tariq Panja from the New York Times and Martyn Ziegler from the Times. It is a year that's beginning in sadness for the world of football, with Pele being buried in Santos, perhaps one of the greatest players of all time and someone we encountered fairly often on our reporting travels. Martyn, how will you remember your encounters with Pele?
Pele was one of these people, as well as obviously his footballing greatness. He was really sort of good for journalists to deal with because he was very sort of accommodating, very friendly. He was never one of these sort of people who put on airs and graces. So I think, after he finished playing for many years, he always had a very good press, probably because of those reasons. And he's just, I think, often seemed to be a sort of likeable guy.
Yeah, Zeke's it's a good point. It's always very accessible when you think of, I guess, the entourages that follow footballers, famous footballers or celebrities today. Just to try and have a word involves a process that makes you not want to do that. You can think of a few footballers like that.
But certainly Pele was approachable, as we found him, as so many found him around the world. And he was buried on Tuesday in a vertical cemetery after several hours of a procession through the streets of Santos. His body had been lying in state at the Santos Football Club for 24 hours. And one noticeable visitor at the wake was the FIFA president, Gianni Infantino. And something that was particularly striking was he actually did more open media at a wake than he did during the entire 5 weeks or so at the World Cup. It looks effectively like a mix zone. He stopped to speak to so many cameras and big hordes of microphones, where actually, when we were in Qatar, there was a struggle to even get a question to him. In fact, we went from the start all the way through the tournament, and it was only right near the end again he could actually face questions, perhaps because sometimes when he has been speaking, there has been some criticism, and that's what happened to him while in Santos for this wake. First of all, on the way into the wake, as he went to see Pele's open casket, he made the suggestion that a football stadium in every country around the world should be named after Pele. That faced some pushback in places particularly like Argentina, who were asked why would they name stadiums after one of the great footballing figures from one of their rivals. And also this very much seemed to be an Infantino idea. And in the wake of that backlash, then FIFA started putting out on its own website, a few days later, several countries that had started to back Gianni Infantino, including Cape Verde, and it turned into a sort of Gianni Infantino initiative that was very much being promoted and then being welcomed when countries did actually announce they were going to name stadiums after Pele.
To be honest, it makes a lot of sense that he's there and he should be there as the president of the World Football Organization to make some comment, etc. But you'd hope that the efforts won't be too extravagant, and the attention is obviously on Pele.
Well, there was something else as well at the wake. Many images went round the world of Gianni Infantino taking a selfie right near the coffin. It was with former teammates of Pele, but still, so many questions about whether it was appropriate for the FIFA president at a sombre moment to be taking a selfie. There was an explanation put out, an indignant response from Gianni Infantino the next day once he'd left Brazil. But Martyn, what did you make of his response to the criticism?
Infantino's explanation as to this is that he was asked to take a selfie with some former teammates of Pele, but I'm not sure that it's, even in those circumstances, it's the right thing to do. I can understand it's difficult to say no to a request, but perhaps you could say, let's do that later, get somebody else to take the picture where it's not such a proximity to Pele's casket. Yeah, I think for a lot of people seeing that, it did seem a bit strange.
Perhaps the latest example of Gianni Infantino not being aware of the appropriateness of saying or doing something in a particular moment. And this wasn't Pele's family asking for a selfie. This was effectively their event. It was teammates. Pele had many teammates, and perhaps it's for Gianni Infantino, who often sees himself akin to a head of state, to judge how actually you should act at a wake. He put out a statement on Instagram bypassing the media, saying, "I hope those who published or said things without knowing and without seeking information could have the decency and courage to admit they were wrong and correct what they said." Well, I think a lot of the comments were actually just, was it appropriate to take a selfie at a wake, regardless of who asked him to take that selfie. Now, Tariq, you remember a particular moment where Pele was at the scene in the build-up to the 2014 World Cup, one of those events, quite an interesting moment.
In 2011, and it was just before the World Cup draw for the World Qualification competition, and a few of us found ourselves in Rio, and it was a moment of high drama with Pele at the centre of it, wasn't it?
So Ricardo Teixeira, who was the head of the Brazilian FA at the time, sort of a long-time opponent of Pele's, had been refusing to speak to the media. He had been very, to the English media at any rate, and he was at the centre of a lot of sort of claims around corruption at the time. And one of our colleagues, Charlie Sale, got into a big row with Teixeira. And then we went to see Pele, who intervened on the English media's behalf, backed us up. And then after that, we were Charlie Sale became star of the show on the Brazilian version of the BBC's 9 o'clock news, being interviewed about this big bust-up.
Yeah, well, we didn't quite know. We didn't quite know it would be. It was TV Globo, and we didn't know exactly how big it was because, we didn't know much about the media environment there. And what happened, if I remember, was these two guys, these journalists and cameraman, came up to Charlie and said, could they interview him? We just thought, I don't know, it was a sports show or something, and they said, Charlie, do you speak Portuguese? No. How about we do it in Spanish? No, only English. And then I remember being stood next to Charlie, and the guy said, "Could you help translate?" And I, for some reason, felt very brave and thought I spoke Spanish at that point in time. And they asked Charlie what he said to Ricardo, what he thought of Ricardo Teixeira. I think Charlie spoke for a minute or two, and I'm not even sure this is correct Spanish even today. I think I said, hombre non correcto. And then we left. And Ziggs, that evening, as we were waiting in the lobby to leave in the hotel, the TV was on the news. And it turned out it was the main news of the night. And Charlie's hombre non correcto was beamed out to millions of people around Brazil, I think, that evening.
Yeah, fortunately, your translation wasn't the one they used. I think they got somebody in who actually could speak different languages properly at that time. Obviously, you improved greatly, but yeah, that clip also did feature Pele, and because he was also asked about the whole issue around Teixeira, and it was due to people like Teixeira that Pele was never involved in the draw for the 2014 World Cup. He was basically snubbed, which was incredible if you consider what a great figure he was. That he, because of the people who ran the federation at the time, they just ignored him.
Ziggs, did it not require the government intervention? I think Dilma Rousseff was a president at the time. I think Pele eventually did get involved, but it required the Brazilian government to step in for that to happen. But like you say, I mean, the idea that the CBF and Teixeira snubbed him in such a way told you a lot about the CBF, about Teixeira, and about his father-in-law Havelange. And it would be no surprise that Teixeira is now, evading arrest and extradition to the United States on corruption charges. Meanwhile, Pele's being mourned by millions of people all over the world.
The first time I actually encountered Pele and interviewed him was with you, Martyn. We were at Sheffield FC for their 150th anniversary celebrations in 2007, and that was just one of those many sort of events that he'd often be at all around the world. He was so sort of ever present, going to various sort of functions, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, the oldest football club in the world. I think it was officially recognised by FIFA. Sepp Blatter came, didn't he? And yeah, Pele was there. great. He was. I saw. I guess I must have seen probably about 6 or 7 things over the last 20 years, if not more, including. I think at the World Cup in 2014, doing a demonstration for Subway.
That's right, Ziegs. It was the Subway sandwich branch in Botafogo. Um, Pele, obviously, a name that a lot of companies and brands want to associate themselves with. And in this case, but for me, it felt quite weird, Rob, that someone of that stature at that time in life, I mean, Pele in many ways was Brazil's ambassador to the world. Was doing that type of thing. But again, I guess it speaks to the fact that unfortunately his finances over the years have seen ups and downs. He was, I think, bankrupted twice through bad advice. Yeah, like you said, the 2014 World Cup, we did see him at the Subway restaurant.
Seemed to be that Subway was the place to find Pele. I once interviewed him as well in a branch in London, actually in 2015. It was a couple months before the FIFA election at the time, and I think some of his people around him got uneasy because I did ask him about who he was supporting, and he said he was supporting Sepp Blatter in that election. Perhaps a rare time we actually heard him getting directly political or getting involved in an issue, because so often he actually steered clear of anything vaguely controversial. Maybe he thought he was saying the least controversial thing at the time.
Yeah, I think even in big politics as well, Pele has always been quite ambiguous, and that he got some criticism for that, particularly when it came to issues around racism or even before, decades ago when Brazil was living under a dictatorship. Pele was never outspoken, but he's spoken about that since, and he kind of said, look. He by being who he was, a very extremely prominent, perhaps the most famous, certainly the most famous Brazilian in the world, and at the time perhaps the most famous person in the world, and being a black man and being from the roots he came from, extreme poverty, he was already kind of just through his act of being who he was. A political figure in a sense. And I think as the decades have gone on and as we got closer to the time he's passed away, I think people have, in some ways, reconciled that fact. I mean, Pele was at the White House at least 3 or 4 times. He's met at least 5 US presidents, for example. He was, this country's ambassador. And I think there's something to be said for that.
And on the racism campaigning, there is no obligation on someone just because they are black to have to become an activist, to have to speak out, because it can be quite painful. He had talked about being a victim of racism in the past from fans in South America. So to actually speak out publicly, you're reliving it in your own mind as well. So that can be a difficult moment.
The other thing about Pele in his political life, I mean, he was actually Minister of Sport for Brazil in the 1990s for a period, and brought in some sort of laws which completely changed the way that the Brazilian Football Federation could operate, and made it more accountable. And that, I think that was the reason he actually fell out with Havelange and Teixeira as a result of that. So he did have a political point of view, and he did do some things, but as you say, it's people in life can make choices for all different sorts of reasons.
When I was in Brazil in 2013 for the Confederations Cup, it's when, quite unexpectedly, there was the civil unrest. There was the protests that were launched against the president at the time, Dilma Rousseff, and it was one of those tournaments where so often going into major events, there's a lot of concerns about what could go wrong, and this is something that hadn't actually been flagged up as a potential because it only began really as the tournament did, and I think it started over bus prices, Tariq, didn't it? These protests.
Yeah, well, I think that was the bus price rise, both in Sao Paulo and Rio, was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back, if you want, and that brought a lot of people into the street. Brazil's economy, obviously under Lula in that first period was enjoying this boost. Brazil's prestige in the world was high, and then the economy started to collapse. And this is when all of that crystallized with the Confederations Cup. It was, say, the bus price rise. And, Brazil never really recovered, did it?
No, and at the time there was some controversy over what Pele said, because he said, let's forget all this commotion happening in Brazil, all the protests, and let's remember how the Brazilian squad is our country and our blood. And I think some saw him being a bit too dismissive of this activism by the people in trying to bring about change, just to focus on football and to focus on the team in this World Cup warm-up tournament.
Well, he said that, Rob. That's a really interesting point that he would have said that then, and it's actually in keeping with what he said. I think very consistently is that for many Brazilians, life is so hard, and like football is this one escape they have. So kind of let them enjoy it. But then on the other hand, that's that bread and circus argument that perhaps doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. Life is hard, and perhaps people sometimes need to speak up for what they believe in. It's a tricky one, isn't it? A tricky balancing act.
Yeah, and on the third day of national mourning in Brazil for Pele on Sunday, New Year's Day, was actually the inauguration of the new president. And as we were saying, so often we saw Pele at various events that were about money making around the world, particularly, say, auctions to sell trinkets from his own career, because he didn't earn the riches that players do now. And in fact, in 2016, it was one of those opportunities to interview him at an auction just about why he was selling various items off from his career.
Depends what the people say you need, but everybody needs money. Everybody have to have some money to live. But fortunately, in this case, doesn't need to be for my future, for my life. No, this is to help some people, and then have to help, as I mentioned, to try to do something from my life to the people.
That was Pele talking to me in 2016 at an auction, perhaps a reflection of the fact Pele did not earn the riches that the modern day generations of superstars do. Superstars like Cristiano Ronaldo on a reported, $200 million now in Saudi Arabia Al Nasser. And his unveiling was actually on Tuesday at the very same time as Pele's funeral.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's the other side of the world. They want to try and get things cracking. This is, I think we can say Cristiano Ronaldo's arrival in Saudi Arabia has been heavily flagged, almost from the moment it became clear he wasn't going to stay at Manchester United. I think, Robin, you and I both spoke to Prince Abdulaziz, the Saudi sports minister, who had made it clear that they wanted to get Ronaldo in the country. And it seemed like there was a sort of concerted campaign to get him.
And even some of the announcements from the club have been filtered through people doing comms for the government. So this is very much connected with the state, it would seem, this initiative.
Guys, absolutely, it's a state project, because the chap you mentioned, this sports minister, he was on social media very quickly celebrating the Ronaldo arrival, saying the state will back further big name signings. But, I don't know about you two, but I'm not that bothered about this at all. For me, yes, the numbers are huge, but I don't really care that much. And that's, for me, a little bit sad in the sense, obviously Ronaldo's career has been fantastic up to this point. He's got all these records, played very well, got people off their seats with some of the football he's played. But he's 37. I just don't find him very interesting at all. He had a terrible World Cup, tried to pretty much overshadow efforts from Portugal. He got himself sacked from Manchester United, probably so he can join this team for this enormous contract. And he did that bizarre interview with Piers Morgan, which reminds me of another interview he gave about 8 years ago to Jonathan Ross, where he said he wants to end his career with a bit of dignity and not go to places like Qatar or the United States. Obviously, he didn't mention Saudi Arabia, but it is of that. And it's exactly what he's done, isn't it?
Well, yeah, just to make clear, he left Manchester United by mutual consent officially after he gave that interview, but United had indicated there would be action that would be taken against him. But, when we reflect on Ronaldo saying he wanted to end his career perhaps at the top, well, he's 37 years old, going on longer than a lot of players do prolong their careers at the top level. So maybe this is just his chance to get another payday, experience something else, when actually he's achieved more in the game than most others would by the age of 37.
He might be short of a few quid, Rob. You're right. He probably needs that money after a 20-year career at the top of one of the world's best paid sports. But yeah, no, absolutely. Good luck to him. If someone's paying you the estimated amounts of money, which, depending, is it 200, is it 250, is it 3 billion, God knows what. It's a lot of money.
Well, he's only worth $500 million, so he's probably short of a few quid.
I think it's hard to put ourselves in his shoes, but we got this sense from his interview with Piers Morgan that what really seemed to be a badge of honour was he's the most followed person on Instagram. So I think, however Richie's already become from his football career, becoming even wealthier and super, super rich is actually an aspiration that he actually seems to hold, maybe.
Yeah, possibly. I think the most interesting thing about this is if other people are going to follow, which has been referenced by the sports minister. But are they going to try and do a sort of live golf style football push, paying kind of crazy sums of money to actually get some of the sort of world's top players? Because
I don't see it happening, though, do you, Ziggs? Do you see that happening? Do you see like a player in their prime, someone between 25 and 35 who could play for Real Madrid or Manchester United or Liverpool, or wanting to say, all right, I'm 28, I'm going to go and play in Saudi Arabia?
Not at the moment. But I mean, stranger things have happened. For example, the Asian Winter Games against Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, there's no sense, I don't think, that suddenly, particularly audiences in Europe, are suddenly going to be tuning in to watch games from Al Nassr. It's not a league that's going to suddenly be watched, just like the French league viewership probably hasn't grown significantly despite Messi, despite Neymar playing there. Yes, there'll be sort of social media interest in standout moments from their games. We'll see clips from Ronaldo, no doubt. There'll be some wondrous moments that will captivate, and people will be saying, oh, we still got it. But obviously, it's a league at a different level. But Saudi Arabia is a football nation. We've had a lot of discussion about Qatar and how strong they are footballing wise and how much local interest there is. Saudi Arabia, they do get the crowds out, and they do have the reigning Asian champions, Al Hilal, being a Saudi club. So the Asian Champions League is a big competition that will get a lot of interest, but it's obviously not going to be Ronaldo on the world stage week in, week out.
No. Yeah, you're right. And you're right about it. They've got absolutely passionate fan culture there. We saw that in Qatar, and if you follow Asian football and you see these Saudi clubs play in that tournament, you see the fan culture there. It just makes me wonder, on one level, he better perform because they're quite knowledgeable. They're not just going to have him sort of walking around the pitch waving at them. That might not be enough for the fans that like football. But on the other hand, as a marketing tool, you mentioned these Instagram followers or whatever, hundreds of millions. That's very important to Saudi Arabia to project itself in the world. And it's not only him. They've got another guy who's not playing in Saudi Arabia, but who is an ambassador for Saudi Arabia, Lionel Messi. He's their Saudi tourism's key signing. So they've now got these two guys who've shared 10 Ballon d'Ors or whatever between them. And guys, they're bidding for all sorts of things, including the 2030 World Cup. So presumably Ronaldo will be wheeled out for that type of thing as well.
Well, that'll be strange because it'll be up against Portugal and Spain. So that'll be an interesting clash, his home country. I wonder actually if eventually Saudi Arabia will have to settle for 2034 as a bid, because I think the way it's looking is that 2030 might be a bit too difficult. It's too close to Qatar, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, it's next door.
No, I mean in terms of timing, obviously it's next door, but in terms of it's like having a World Cup in England in 2030 and then Scotland 8 years later.
Depends. Can I show you this big briefcase, Martyn? Would you be interested in letting me host your football tournament?
Would that be for help development funds, that sort of thing?
We hope you would, but you can use it for whatever you think would be best. But we'd like you to. But it's up to you how you choose to use this briefcase.
That's well, of course, as we reflect on both Ronaldo and Pele, of course, Pele himself made a move to a lesser-known football nation in his career after he'd already left Santos once he thought his playing days were over. He went and joined the New York Cosmos. In fact, I remember talking to him about this in 2007 when seeing him in Sheffield, and he was a bit critical of the way things actually operated in the States. He actually called for lifting restrictions on player movements and all the sort of restrictive practices in the US, and giving more freedom to owners of teams to be able to sort of buy and sell players. But yeah, Pele himself did go to the US when that was backwater of soccer.
He did, and he grew the game's popularity immensely there. And as we said, Saudi Arabia isn't a backwater for the game, one of Asia's powerhouses. I'm not sure Cristiano Ronaldo grows the game in Saudi Arabia, where it's already popular. And can you imagine Ronaldo speaking out at all about practices and customs in Saudi Arabian football, Rob?
Absolutely not. That seems hard to imagine. Well, as we do look ahead to 2023 and the various battles to come, a lot around the world of FIFA post-Qatar, and some of the decisions taken in Qatar are going to reverberate through the year. I think we're going to see quite a year of conflict potentially, aren't we, in football? That was set up by this announcement of the 32-team Club World Cup for 2025. Is that going to be one of the key things we're going to be following through the year?
Yeah, that's one thing. I think the other major sort of footballing thing is going to be the financial distribution of the Champions League post 2024. I think that's going to be an interesting thing. I mean, I imagine is probably the formula may be similar to what it is now in the end. But I think that's something we'll closely follow. But yeah, the wrangles around the calendar, which is obviously the 32-team World Cup, the size and format of the next World Cup, Men's World Cup, those are big issues. And of course, there's the other World Cups too, Women's World Cup taking place in Australia and New Zealand, Rugby World Cup in France. So it's going to be a busy year, isn't it?
World Athletics Championships in Budapest in August.
Yeah, the FIFA presidential election and UEFA presidential election, they're going to be tough ones for the incumbents, aren't they?
Hotly contested. But Ziegs, on a lot of what you've talked about there as themes for 2023, certainly when it comes to football, these are arguments that have been dragging on now for years, haven't they? If you think about Club World Cup fight, distribution of Champions League and European competition income, it's kind of, this stuff should have been sorted out, and then the pandemic happened. But there is an urgency, really, particularly for Club World Cup and for 48-team qualification campaigns and that calendar, because the 10-year football calendar really does need to be put in place now, doesn't it? Surely, with qualification for the World Cup in America, Canada, and Mexico having to start, in the next couple of years, the TV rights for that to be sold, this Club World Cup being put in place, they can't just keep dragging this out, can they?
And there's ramifications of the expansion of the Men's World Cup to 48 teams as well from 2026, which is qualifying, particularly in South America, where how many places do they get now for the 10 nations? It's going to really...
6.5.
Yeah, which means actually it's a foregone conclusion, isn't it, almost, for the big nations to actually qualify.
Yeah, because they had quite a good, in terms of the sort of TV rights and the sort of general interest, they had quite a sort of popular qualification tournament involving every single country, didn't they? And it went on for ages and ages, it seemed to, anyway. But yeah, but you're going to get a situation where most of the matches are going to be sort of fairly uninteresting, I think. So that's definitely something that they're going to have to try and tackle.
Well, here's something with that, though. There's been this idea that they split them into two groups. So you have two groups of 5, and they reduce the number of games. And Brazil, for example, they're really up for that because it will free them up for more dates to play, perhaps competitive games against European nations. They'll be better prepared for tournaments like the World Cup. But for the smaller teams in South America, they're not keen on that because selling a game against Brazil is worth a lot of money when you're doing your TV rights. So that usual tension is there. But yeah, it'd be good if there was a proper debate, really, about what happens to national team football. Rob, we've had a really good World Cup. It's been really exciting. These matches are really compelling, massive audience numbers, and then national team football goes back to qualification and friendlies and all that, and it isn't very interesting. And that's where we are, aren't we?
Well, one of the issues is that FIFA did launch a consultation in 2021, but it was only after they'd already announced their plans for a biennial World Cup, trying to sort of state the case afterwards to try to lead to that conclusion. And then once that plan collapsed, it seems the whole public debate of that has faded away. The legends were rolled out, weren't they, by FIFA to make the case for the biennial World Cup, rather than using that period now onwards to look at that deeper discussion and to have the debate in public, because there aren't simple conclusions. You can all decide, various different ways. How many international windows should there be? How should qualifying look? There's no necessarily perfect solution, which is why actually a public debate would be quite healthy and quite vibrant for the game.
Yeah, no, for sure. What one thing that I think also is going to, I'm sure, still be a really big issue in 2023, and has raised its head again, is racism in sport and football particularly. And there's been a strange reaction, I think, by Javier Tebas at La Liga to Vinicius Junior's saying he was racially abused by Atletico Madrid fans, because he sort of tweeted saying La Liga aren't doing enough about it, or not doing anything about racism.
And the response from Javier Tebas on Twitter was very combative and showing very little regard for Vinicius Junior being a victim. And what Tebas actually tweeted was, at La Liga, I've been fighting racism for years. Vinicius Junior, it is unfair and untrue to publish that La Liga does nothing against racism. Find out more. We're at your disposal so that all together we can walk in the same direction. Now, that tone is very hostile, isn't it, towards someone who's just experienced racism at a La Liga game, as he said.
Considering when you look at the context of the two individuals who've said that. But yeah, very thin-skinned from Tebas, but that is, to be honest, how he tends to operate, right? On issues where you've seen him on a number of issues, just firing broadsides from that Twitter account, sometimes justified, sometimes not, like here maybe. But on the broader point, I remember talking to the new Brazilian football president, Ronaldo, who first black Brazilian football president, and he's wants a stronger global action on racism. Brazilian players were racially abused. There was a banana thrown at them at friendly in France, for example, before the World Cup, towards Vinicius, in fact. And he spoken about his disgust. He wanted to walk away from the stadium and take the players off. But he's talked about, Martyn, Rob, about stadium closures, even points deductions. We're still not seeing points deductions for racism. I know maybe it's difficult, but the sanctions that we have now across the board, are they doing enough?
Well, we did hear from Gianni Infantino expressing solidarity after the Lecce player Samuel Umtiti went off in tears after facing racist abuse from Lazio fans with Serie A resuming in the last week. Lamek Banda also is racially abused, and Infantino posted on Instagram, "No to racism," and he said, "May the huge majority of fans who are good people stand up to shut up all the racists once and for all." So he's putting the responsibility on other fans to sort of drown out the racism almost. It's not saying anything FIFA will do or any sort of action.
Yeah, I mean, I saw La Liga's statement about the Vinicius incident. And I thought it was really, I mean, it just seemed to be sort of, somebody like typing out the same old stuff. There was nothing about, we're going to investigate the club. We're going to hold the club responsible, because that's what you have to do. The clubs have to be held responsible for their fans. If it's just one supporter, you can see maybe it's difficult to punish the club. If it's a group of supporters abusing a player, then the club has to be held responsible. And it is in Europe. You can certainly argue that perhaps the sanctions aren't as tough as they should be from UEFA and in any international club football competition. But
Maybe this is something a football regulator could get involved with,
exactly,
which is something coming to English football, it seems, now in 2023.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak has sort of reported to have given his approval to it. There was a bit of a wobble on the regulator when Liz Truss came in, and being anti-regulation generally as Prime Minister, her advisors were basically decided that they didn't want it. They wanted football to sort it out. I think that was as short-lived as her premiership, and it's back on the table. Rishi Sunak's fully in favour. I think we'll see a white paper in the next few weeks that will outline the full powers, and I think it is going to be quite a powerful one.
Ziegs, for people not au fait with how policy works in the UK, so what does that mean that a white paper will be published? What does that mean in terms of having someone in place? When will that happen?
Yeah, so this would be for this is for English football to have a statutory regulator, a bit like the sort of broadcast watchdog Ofcom, and a white paper is draft legislation, proposed legislation. So it's setting out, this is what it would look at. For example, they might say the regulator will take over responsibility for overseeing the sale of football clubs, for doing checks on owners and directors, taking over responsibility for disciplinary issues. So, for example, the Premier League cannot investigate its own clubs. And possibly even power over the financial distribution from the Premier League to the lower leagues. So fairly broad-ranging powers. Interesting to see how long it would take to get through. I can't see it coming into place for next season at all. I think it would have to be the 2024-2025 season at the earliest.
So one of those things, could it be, I don't know, now we're in 2023, now we can stay, instead of 4 years, the Premier League investigation into Manchester City, for example, entering its 5th year now without a resolution. Is that the sort of thing that a regulator like this would be looking at?
Absolutely, it would have to. I mean, I think for many people that would be the main benefit of it, because it's sport investigating itself or its own members it's never good. It's marking its own homework. You actually have a situation at the Premier League where the employees are investigating one of its employers, which is anyone can see that's
maybe. Well, one of the big problems to confront for sport in 2023 is what to do about Russian teams. We've had Russia already suspended from qualifying for Euro 2024 in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine last year. Are Russian players allowed at Wimbledon? British tennis is under threat of further sanctions if Russian players and players from Belarus are banned just as they were in 2022. So some really tough decisions for sports to take as this war continues that Putin launched on Ukraine.
Yeah, I think as I might have mentioned in a recent previous podcast, it looks like the International Olympic Committee is looking at changing this, changing their sort of recommendation for a ban on Russians taking part in international competitions. I think they're going to go down they'll have to go under a neutral banner. And there have been lots and lots of stuff about, politics shouldn't interfere with sport. That's the Olympic ideal. So I think Thomas Bach will, in the next few weeks, say that this thing, Russians can take part in Olympic qualifying competitions, which basically that opens the floodgates as far as I'm concerned. Nobody else is going to stand in the way and say, you can't take part in sport because look at the Olympics, they're allowing them. So yeah, here we are. You won't have the Russian flag, but you can take part. And that, I'm sure, will be in English tennis competitions as much as anywhere else.
Pretty much what the IOC has tended to do, though, hasn't it? As you ban people while there's no competition to be banned from, and then once the competition or the qualification period begins, find a way to open those doors. And I think it's a well-trodden path when it comes to the IOC in Russia. You only have to look at the aftermath of the biggest doping program in sports history to see what's happened. And I guess here we go. Rob, the other massive thing, surely for us, I guess, during the World Cup, two of the world's biggest football clubs were put up for sale, weren't they? We're going to have
both Manchester United and Liverpool have been put up for sale, so they're competing in the same waters for big investors. Particular challenges at Manchester United needing investment in the stadium. Liverpool have already started to modernise the stadium in recent years. Squads at different levels. Liverpool might miss out on the Champions League qualification. Maybe Manchester United will as well. So interesting positions both teams are in.
Yeah, it's one of the private equity organisations in America, if they're going to lining up to invest, because I think there's still a feeling that there's space to grow for football in terms of broadcast revenues. They think there's an expectation that sooner or later a big internet streaming giant is going to do something, which they think, I think there's a sort of, if people are betting on what's going to happen, that the Premier League is the place to be in football, which it probably is. But it's an interesting one. Same with Chelsea. It's not easy to take over a Premier League club and achieve success unless you're someone like Roman Abramovich, for whom money is no object.
Is it still no object? Who knows, given the situation he's in. And who would have imagined 2023 would start with Roman Abramovich no longer owning Chelsea, having been forced to sell the club under the weight of British government sanctions after Russia launched that war on Ukraine. So much unpredictable can happen in sport, as we covered in Sport Unlocked. And that about brings an end to this episode at the start of 2023. From myself, Rob Harris, Martyn Ziegler and Tariq Panja, thank you all for listening. You can message us as ever at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. But for now, enjoy whatever sport you're watching. Goodbye.